Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. This week, that is the buzzword that I'm sure you've already heard a ton going into last week. Trump is just swinging these tariffs around kind of like a wrecking ball and seemingly without any true aim or direction. Today, what we're going to do is discuss the implications of all these tariffs, why it's tanking the stock market so much, and really who's to benefit from all this. And is there a real solution to bring these crazy prices that we're all seeing nowadays down? I'm your host, Sal Assante. This is the We The Patriots Podcast. Let's get right into it. So, today we are talking about tariffs. Not too many people, or I'm not sure how many people I should say, are invested in the stock markets yourself, are too keen on what's going on. If you are, I am glad to have you here and would love your input on some of the things I'm going to say. But otherwise, I myself am invested in the stock market. I have been for going on over 5 years now, actually. So I feel like I can give somewhat of a realistic approach to this, anecdotal, of course, but also with some facts mixed in. And without any further ado, no more rambling. Let's get into the story today. The stock market is down 10% basically in 2 days. Back-to-back days, basically seeing S&P 500, which I'm basing most of my metrics off of. So the S&P dropped 5% each day, a total of about 12%, depending on what you're going off of. And is that a big deal? Well, first we got to acknowledge a couple things before we go into the tariffs. Just how many Americans are invested in the stock market. Research shows that it's somewhere around 60%. Now, most of those individuals are not going to be able to touch that money for quite some time. And that, of course, is because lots of them are invested in accounts like retirement accounts, 401ks, Ross, something that keeps you away from your money until at least 59 and a half, if not 64 and a half. So with that said, who is it impacting the most? Well, it's going to be people who are either using cash accounts, accounts that are not tied to retirement accounts. Like for myself, I have retirement accounts, yes, but I also have cash accounts that I trade with some extra money that I like to keep aside and possibly grow. Those are the people that it's affecting the most. Not all Americans, actually, a minority of Americans have accounts like the one I just mentioned, a cash account. But that being said, most of the people who are affected, this is not all, but most of the people who are affected are in about the top 10 to 20% of earners across the nation. So, who is this impacting the most? Well, it's impacting you if you have retirement funds. That being said, you probably can't touch those for a while. So, is it really affecting you? And should you be getting that upset about it? Well, we're going to get kind of into that in a little bit. For those of you that do trade, or maybe you're a day trader, maybe it does affect you a little bit more. And we're going to talk about that too. Tariffs. Let's get this big one out of the way. What is a tariff? It's not that complicated, actually. And believe it or not, tariffs were the one of two of the only ways that the United States government, the federal government anyway, could actually generate revenue off of the American people. Up until the year 1913. What happened in 1913 was the 16th Amendment that was under the Wilson administration, and that was the ability to levy a federal income tax. Great, you say, but I still haven't answered what a tariff is. Well, tariff was, again, one of the only two ways, other than an excise tax, and we'll get into that in a second, that the government could generate money. And what was a tariff? Well, it was a tax on a good, either imported or exported, basically to other countries. So what does that mean? Let's say that we have a 10% tariff on goods coming from China. What would happen is the person who is selling you the good from China would get taxed an additional 10% in order to sell it to an American customer. What happens in that case? What happens in that case is that the American consumer, unless that company, which I'm pretty sure most of us know that companies are not just going to foot the bill for a 10% rise in their cost, that's going to get passed on to the consumer. So what does that mean? Let's say you're buying a car. We'll just keep it super general, and this is obviously not the prices. I'm not trying to seem like a boomer, like I don't know the prices of things, but just to keep it easy. So let's say you have a 10% tariff on Chinese cars, and a Chinese car gets sold for $10,000. $10,000 car comes to America and is sold. The dealership is going to impose an additional 10% cost on you, making the car cost $11,000 before any sort of loan, any sort of interest that gets tacked on that. It's an $11,000 car. Pretty simple, I think. What it could also mean, which doesn't in most cases for us, is that it can happen to exports, but most of the tariffs that are implemented by the United States are implemented on the import, meaning that it only happens when we purchase goods. So, with that out of the way, what's an excise tax? The other tax that was implemented by the American government before we actually had the implementation of both payroll taxes and income taxes. What an excise tax is essentially a tax on a certain good. So I want you to think of the whiskey tax, something that happened again in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States, and as well as things like, taxes on gas would be an excise tax like the gas tax that all of our New Jerseyans like to say. That would be an excise tax. And that was, again, the only way that the federal government could make money. Now, for Woodrow Wilson, in order to implement some of the plans that he wanted to do, one of the ways that he figured would be that we could actually get a more efficient income and a more steady income by taxing people directly, meaning right off of their income. So, how did he do that? He pushed Congress, I should say. Congress implemented this 16th Amendment, which was to allow the United States to collect an income tax. Now, you look at taxes and all the revenue that come in. I believe it's less than 10% of all revenue actually comes from tariffs nowadays, and the majority of all revenue coming into the federal United States is coming from payroll and income taxes. I think we all are very familiar with payroll and income taxes, but I'll break those down just a little bit. So you have the actual FIT, the federal income tax that you see on your pay stub if you get one, and that is just a direct tax paid to the government. Then payroll taxes are something like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, anything taken that's going out of your paycheck, not directly funding the federal income tax. And of course, you have state income taxes on top of all of that. What Trump is seemingly trying to do, okay? And I'm not trying to act like I know what's going on in his head, but what he's seemingly trying to do is to level the playing field. Now, do you agree with this? That's going to be kind of up to debate, and I want you guys to let me know what you think in the comments of if you agree with the way that Trump is going about this. But what's been done is that a lot of countries, I believe it's 10% across the board. Yep, looks like 10% across the board on any import from any country is going to be the lowest barrier of tariff, and then it goes all the way up to, I believe, the highest one that I saw was 49% increase. That's talking about going on China. China, what you need to understand too, one of the big arguments coming from the Trump camp is that there is a trade deficit. Now, one of the biggest problems with looking at things as in a deficit when you're looking at trade is that maybe there's a reason for that. Okay. And a lot of what that's going to come down to is labor, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later in the show. But when it comes down to it, what these tariffs are seemingly intended to do, or if you're going to trust Trump on his word, is to bring back jobs to the United States and incentivize companies to work in the United States or hire workers in the United States to avoid these taxes. But that just doesn't really make sense. And we'll get into that in a little bit as well. Now, kind of what I just want to go over is some of the more important taxes that were levied by Trump. For example, Trump dealt a pretty heavy tariff over to China. There's already an existing 20% tariff. He upped that by 34%. If you look at what the existing tariff is on the United States, it's 7%, and that's as of 2019. That could have changed by now. Basically, what that means is that Trump more than doubled the rate that we receive on our goods going to China. In Canada, he bumped it up from 10% going all the way up to 25%. Mexico is up to 25%. The European Union is 20%. India is 26%. Japan 26%. South Korea 25%. Taiwan 32%. Vietnam 46%. Thailand 36%. Cambodia 49%. Brazil 10%. UK 10%. Australia 10%, Switzerland 31%, Israel 17%. That never existed before, and again, all others are at the baseline of 10%. Now, is it fair to say that all these countries deserve some sort of tariff? Very possibly, and the reason being is that they all had tariffs on us, so it really shouldn't be looked at as an unfair play by Trump, I should say, in order to utilize tariffs against these countries because, well, in many cases, or in all cases, these countries have tariffs on U.S. imports as well. Now, what many advocates of the anti-Trump position saying that he's an idiot for implementing these taxes, many of what the angle that they're using to defend other countries utilizing tariffs on us is to protect their domestic industry. And I kind of find that funny, because if you're to listen to Trump's reasoning for implementing tariffs on these other countries, wouldn't the same argument be made on our behalf, that we are protecting American interests and American companies by implementing these tariffs and insinuating a more domestic production of product? The answer to that, I think, would be yes. Again, I'm not trying to come from a pro-Trump or an anti-Trump perspective, but you can't just be one-sided in this argument and say that other countries are allowed to protect their own industries without the United States being able to do the same. Now, it being an unbalanced amount of tariff, that could be an argument, I think, very well founded. Again, so I'll go back to China. They have a 20% tariff on us. We are utilizing a 54% at this point cap tariff on China. Canada 25%, and their max tariff is 4.5%, and that's gone up since. Canada 7%, and they're up to 25%. The European Union as a whole around 5%, and it's up to 20%. What a lot of people are arguing against for the European Union in specifics is that there are many hidden taxes being put onto goods sold as American goods in the European Union, and from what I could tell, most of that is just bogus. Seems like their rate of a 5% tariff is pretty flatline. And other than that, that's what you're going to pay. You're going to pay that extra 5% as a consumer, and other than that, yeah, go at it. Now, an interesting piece of my research that I just pulled up and I didn't even realize was a part of my research, just a note here, is that 13% is from India's tariff on the United States, 13.8 to be exact. However, 100% tariff on motorcycles. Thought that was a little fascinating. That doesn't really have a lot to do with the narrative here. But my broader point is that a lot of these tariffs are pretty unilateral and not actually, I'd say, fair based on what we're getting tariffed. So I wonder what Trump's play is there. Lowering it to zero doesn't really help anybody, and I'll get into that in a little bit as well when it comes to wages. But when you think about a reciprocal tariff, you think about something being fair both ways, and these are just very unilateral. And what I'm talking about here is that the United States tariffs are much higher than the tariffs we're receiving as a whole. Now, one thing that was interesting to me was the amount of tariff that was laid on Taiwan. That's 32%. Now, the one thing that's exempt, which people were kind of up in arms about, was semiconductors. So basically what's needed to make electronic chips. The whole reason, really, at this point in time, that America is so invested in making sure Taiwan remains independent from China, as China has been in many different ways threatening to take over that area of the world. You could see that there are certain little nuances here included in these tariffs that are kind of just done seemingly because they have to. Now, I do want to get into the wages here, because this is a big reason as to why the United States, in my opinion, cannot compete in the world stage of manufacturing. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look across the entirety of the US, we have a federal minimum wage of $7.25, might be $7.50 by now. I think it's $7.25. And in general, there are states like my own, like New Jersey, like New York, like California, that have minimum wages as high as 15, 16, 17, or even $18 an hour, depending on the part of the state that you're actually in. And you compare that to around the world, where wages range in places like Vietnam, something like $1 to $2 an hour, China, $2 to $5 an hour. Many other places that minimum wage is not very existent. If that's the case, I want you to think a little bit big box here. How could we possibly compete with that? There is no amount of tariff. Well, technically, there is an amount of tariff that could equalize our production, but the amount of tariff would be so high it would be absurd to even say out loud. So there's another piece of that puzzle that kind of comes into whether we can actually compete. So let's think about something extremely cheap, something like a textile. When I say textile, if you're unaware of the term, basically what it means is like printing things like shirts, linen cloth, stuff like that. It's not actually things made out of text or paper, but something like a shirt. And a shirt that's produced in China, mass produced in China, you may have, $10 item from China, but if you're going to produce it directly in the United States, source all the material, that shirt may actually come out to be a $25, $30 shirt before taking profits. Now, There's another argument to be made on the wage front that I think needs to be taken into account. Many people will argue that although the wages are very disparate in between places like Vietnam, the United States, or China and the United States, however, what you get out of that higher wage is more production. And this is true, generally speaking, based on the research that I've come up with. Just in comparison to China, we are looking at an American worker doing the same job as a Chinese worker, being somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 5 times more efficient at their job. Okay, so let's say 3 to 5 times more efficient. Now let's do the math. Of the average worker in the United States, you're talking somewhere around between $25 and $35 an hour is about the average hourly rate. Okay, now obviously there are many, many people across this country, and I'm sure many of you who are listening to this that are underneath that average rate of $25 to $35 an hour. And I completely understand that, but for the argument's sake, average hourly rate is somewhere around $25 to $35 an hour. And you look at China's, the average rate of pay is somewhere in the ballpark of $3 to $5 per hour. So all you have to do is multiply our $3 to $5 an hour by 3 to 5 times the efficiency, and you can get multiple workers at the same cost as an American worker. Talk about efficiency. You are talking about, you take the low scale of $3 per hour and multiply it by 5, you're only up to $15 spent on employees. You talk about on the upper echelon of $5 an hour, if that's the upper pay scale, and you're only at the bottom of our average, which is pretty crazy to think about, right? So when you talk about efficiency and the ability to levy tariffs in order to mitigate the disparity between the pay rates of somewhere like China compared to the United States, well, you would need quite a significant amount of tariff in order to make up for that. You take that low end, and we'll say that you're trying to cover the goods made by someone making $3 per hour, even if they're less efficient by up to 70% than an American worker. You need a tariff something like 80 to 90% in order to get an equal amount of cost to the consumer on something like a t-shirt. Now, this is why I don't think that the United States can compete on something like textiles or something simple like, for example, a toaster or a refrigerator that is commonly made overseas. And the reason being is that we just are not really that efficient as American manufacturers at making these products. Now, where could we see the American product actually benefit would be something like high tech, something like airplanes, something like the creation of software, right? These are things that we export at this point. This is our intelligence getting put into an item and being broadcast across the world. And for that, you can absolutely make an argument that we can compete on the world stage. But competing across the board or something like steel that we saw Trump go after heavily in his first term, really not so much. So if we go into the first term of Trump, and I'll be coming back to wages and efficiency and how we might be able to see the costs come down in a little bit. That'll be the last thing we talk about today. When you look back on the first term of Trump, Trump said he wants to bring back manufacturing jobs. You look back at the first term, what he did with steel, for example, is that during 2018, 2019, a lot of tariffs going on, especially when it came to steel. There was a claim that steel actually gained about 1,000 jobs, but when you look at the downstream being all the people that are involved in the back end work, not necessarily people involved in the direct production of steel, but possibly the salesmen, possibly the office workers or the managers actually dealing with these groups of people. We actually lost 75,000. We saw a net loss of about $245,000. I apologize, 1,000 jobs lost net over this time of tariffing in complete relation to steel. So when you're talking about the issue of raising tariffs in order to compete, the big question there is with what? Can we compete again on things that are high tech, something like airplanes, something like computers? Yes, more than likely. If you're talking about something low scale, something like textiles, something like a refrigerator, even at this point, something like a car, the answer is really no. And it's a little alarming that we have, in the United States, kind of become this place where it costs so much to do anything, but a lot of that comes down to labor. As anyone who's read any bit of The Wealth of Nations, which is a quite old book at this point, that's by Adam Smith. But if you are going to read that and understand, one of the biggest takeaways from the book is that at the end of the day, one of the biggest costs for anything is the labor cost. And what is labor cost? Well, that's the human element that's involved. And that's kind of important when you look at ways to lower cost. So what are the actual ways, if Trump is being genuine in his way of attempting to lower costs to Americans? One of the biggest things that would need to be really pushed after would be automation. Now, can automation really be achieved? The biggest problem there is not really, because let's think about the multifaceted problem there when it comes to automation. Yes, you can automate a lot and get robots to do the jobs of humans and replace, which will happen. Don't get me wrong, it will happen. But the biggest issue there is you're displacing Americans who no longer have a job. And if the Americans no longer have a job to afford the cheaper products, well, that's kind of counterintuitive to lowering the price in the first place, isn't it? So, no, you're not going to be bringing jobs back to America. In a lot of cases, this was an argument made for a long time, is that you keep raising the minimum wage. What are companies going to strive to do? Think about that self-checkout line at a supermarket, the self-checkout line at a pharmacy. Almost rarely are you even dealing with someone when you go to some place like ShopRite. You go someplace like Whole Foods. You are checking out on a computer yourself. You go to a Walgreens, you're checking out on a computer yourself. You are not even dealing with a human being. You're lucky to see someone, a manager roaming around the store. So this kind of trend of getting more towards automation and less actual in-person workers is going to continue, to be honest. As long as prices and costs for businesses keep going up, automation is going to keep going up. And with automation coming into the forefront, you're going to see a lot less jobs actually available to the average American people. Now, with all that said, what's another way to lower cost? Of course, would be to lower the wages. What is the issue with lowered wage? Well, number one, we have a federal minimum wage. Is that going to be lowered? I can guarantee you absolutely not. And another issue that you're going to run into in lowering wages is you're going to run into all the unions that are built up in the United States. Now, a huge problem with cost of labor in the United States at this point is all the benefits that go along with labor. Think about healthcare, think about retirement packages. All of these things brought together make up the total cost of labor. It's not just the hourly rate or the annual salary of an employee, but it's also all these benefits added up. Now, to be fair, a lot of these benefits are a tax deduction for the company if they're going to offer them. But that being said, you're just talking about a tax deduction. You're not talking about a lowering in overall cost. And it's one of the biggest drivers to the high prices that we pay nowadays in the United States is the pure labor cost. Think about someone who's making $25 an hour, but then they also have a health insurance plan through their company and they have a retirement plan. You look at the end of the day figures and you really put it on paper, that person's getting paid not really about $25 an hour. They're probably getting paid somewhere more in the ballpark of $40 an hour when you lay it all out. And that is just not able to compete on the world stage when you're talking about manufacturing. Is that fair? Is another question to ask, and I think it's a fair question to raise. Could Trump be levying these taxes in order to be the world's policeman and try to get other countries to raise their wages? I think it's far-fetched. I don't think that's actually the reason. However, it could be something that is kind of a downstream effect. I don't think it's going to work, to be fair. I don't think other countries are going to raise a minimum wage whatsoever. Think about someplace like China. There's so many people living in that country that they could just find another person on the street that really needs a job and they could just fire someone who's trying to unionize. And that's completely sidestepping the fact that they are a somewhat communist country. And let's just say that there's not so many rights to the citizen there like there is in the United States. Again, could this be a leverage tool being used by the United States government in order to try to, again, be kind of like the world's police force and raise other countries up? Yeah, it's possible, or it could be a downstream effect, but I don't really think that that's something that's A, going to happen, or B, is really a goal of the United States. And you think about somewhere like, for example, Vietnam or India, where the average price could be even less than $1 for an hour of work by an employee. If the entire market in India or the entire market in Vietnam domestically in those countries cannot handle the weight of paying someone $5, $10 an hour, then they're just not going to pay it. Whereas in law in the United States, it is required that someone is paid at a minimum $7.25 for every hour worked, and that's the minimum wage. Again, I kind of bring back to my whole point that this is really the driver of the massive costs that we see here in the United States and realistically across the entire world. Talk about bringing tariffs into it. What you're really talking about is raising the price for the end consumer. And I think everybody kind of understands that. Again, I'll go back to my main point. The first point that I made today was that that was one of the only ways that the United States actually generated revenue was based on tariffs back in the day. Now, it's such a minute amount of our earnings that it's not even really a thought by most politicians. And Donald Trump has been the first person in quite a long time to publicly, not that he's been the only one, but the only one who's really publicly made it a point that he's going to utilize tariffs as not only a negotiating tool, but a possible way of bringing jobs back to the United States. But I want you to look at the big picture. Look at the amount of wages that we need to pay employees here in the United States, whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're an end consumer producer, someone like myself who works in landscaping and construction. At the end of the day, the biggest cost to a business like the one that I work in is the labor, is the people working. It's really not any sort of product. Like a material could go up 5, 10, 15% even. But at the end of the day, when you look at the cost makeup, so much of it is due to labor. And if the labor price just went up $1.50 compared to what it is right now, that would massively affect the end pay that we have to pay and take on as a cost of the business in comparison to something like a tariff raising on one product that we get from overseas. So look at it at the end of the day. There are some ways that we might be able to reduce some costs. Again, things like automation, things like lowering the wages. But number one, is it feasible? In most cases, not. Number two, is it really going to reduce the cost to the level that we're hoping? Realistically, not. And think about the amount of different types of people travel the world of an egg, right? And you're looking at the egg's way of getting to your house. What does that egg need to do? It needs to get produced by a farmer. The farmer went and bought the chicken. The farmer needs to feed the chicken. Where does that feed come from? In a lot of cases, that is grown by a different farmer, if not grown on the farm themselves, which I believe in many cases is actually illegal. So they have to go buy that at a market. The market bought it from someone else who grew it. That had to get trucked from both locations and is going to get freight all the way back to the actual farm that's making the egg. Then that egg needs to be produced by the chicken, taken by the farmer, needs in our country to be sanitized, and then freighted over to somewhere like a market, supermarket chain. By the time that the egg actually reaches the supermarket, before you even buy it and bring it back to your house, it's actually had to go through many different phases of labor. Whether you're talking about the farmer himself, the person who made the feed, the trucking from feed to market, market to the original farmer, or farmer shipping that egg out to a market. You have so many different phases of labor, and that's just an egg. You start getting into something a little bit more complex, like a computer, right? Like a t-shirt that's involving many different types of material, whether you're talking about the vinyl that needs to be made in order to make the lettering and the actual cotton or whatever fabric material is actually being used, then the people that need to sew that together into a shirt, person who's going to design the shirt, getting that shipped out to somewhere that's going to sell, somewhere like a Walmart, online store, whatever. Things that get more and more complex, you start going up into computers, cars, things that are taking different elements from many different places around the world. And you start to see why things cost so much money. And at the end of the day, when you're looking at the massive increases of cost across the world, so much of these cost increases that we've seen are not actually due to something like a tariff being unequally applied for certain nations. And is it really feasible to lower the cost with tariffs? And my answer to you is I really don't think so. You're not going to see too many jobs come back to the United States. If anything, you're going to see jobs killed by the fact that many people can't afford the products that they need, especially as a business. And yeah, it's, to me, what the end goal here doesn't seem to align with what's actually happening. Now, a couple points I want to circle back on. Number one, the stock market is not the economy. I believe I've said this in many shows before, but I'll say it again. The stock market is not the economy. Just because you see a 10% drop in the economy, or of course I had to mix the words right there, but it's pretty typical. 10% drop in the stock market is not indicative of the economy not producing well. I don't know who needs to hear that, but it just is not. So much of it is what happens to the underlying GDP of the nation, the employment numbers, and a different aggregate of many different factors that actually determine whether we are in a recession or not. And except for that little one that went on during Biden that nobody wanted to call a recession, generally speaking, what a recession actually is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. So that is the indicator that you all should be looking out for. You should not be following the stock market and think because it's going down in numbers that we are in a recession, because that's not actually true. And another thing that I want to circle back on just before we end the actual show, because I don't think I touched on it when I wanted to, is trade deficit. Is a trade deficit actually bad? Well, there was a good point made by, I want to say it was Ben Shapiro, who I begrudgingly mentioned because I've stopped listening to him for quite some time, but he made a good point. A trade deficit can not inherently be a bad thing. You have to think about your daily interactions with different people. Think about someone like your barber. In many cases, you go to your barber, you spend $15, $20, $30, $40, whatever it is on a haircut. If you're a woman, probably a little more. You spend whatever it is on a haircut. And in most cases, your barber is not going to purchase whatever it is that you do for work, or if you own a business, not going to purchase your product. You are in a trade deficit to your barber. Does that mean that that's a bad trade situation, or are you losing that trade? The answer to that is no. You are actually getting the product that you paid for, and you are in deficit technically because you spent more money on the product that you bought and not getting money back. But at the end of the day, you got what you paid for. And that is the essence of what a trade deficit is. We have a trade deficit with China. What does that mean? Well, that means that we bought more product from China than China bought from the United States. Is that inherently a bad thing? I would say no, not really. And the reason being, maybe we're not producing the type of product or the amount of product or a combination of the two that China is actually wanting to buy. Or maybe they just don't spend that much money outside of their own economy, their own domestic economy. And that's okay. At the end of the day, if the people, the end consumers, are getting what they want out of the products that they're buying, a trade deficit is not a bad thing. So I don't really understand the angle that Trump and his team have been taking, saying that we have too many trade deficits running and not any trade surpluses, because, well, we need to be producing product in order to make a surplus, and just levying tariffs willy-nilly on other countries is not really going to make them spend more with us. In most cases, we're going to get retaliatory tariffs on our own country, and they are going to be less willing to perform trades with us anyway. So with all that said, what can we take away from this? Well, first of all, I hope you understand now what a tariff is. Tariff is a before purchase tax on a good that is imported from another country, in the United States case. Again, a lot of times that can actually be import or export, but in most cases for the United States, it is when we are importing a good from another country. We are implying a tax that is on the seller. The seller has to charge you, the end consumer, more money. It was the original way for the United States to make money until the implementation of payroll and income taxes. And ever since then, it has actually taken a backseat in terms of the amount of money that it generates, talking about tariffs. So are tariffs inherently good or bad? Not necessarily either. It is another way to kind of shoe the tax burden so that it's not directly on your income. But at the end of the day, tax is tax. There's the two certainties in life, right? The death and taxes. And I will add a third, and it's corrupt politicians, which seem to be more and more today. Take that away. I hope you also take away that the economy is not indicative by the stock market. That is not the only indicator that we need. In many cases, actually, it's a very poor indicator of economic health. And at the end of the day, there are some things we can do to lower costs, but they're all going to really suck. We're talking about implementing robots, implementing lower wages as a whole, cutting back on expenditures like benefits, something like healthcare, something like a retirement plan. And can we compete on the world stage when it comes to low-scale manufacturing? When I say low-scale, I mean lower quality items, talking about textiles, talking about something like low-grade electronics, like a toaster, talking like a refrigerator. At the end of the day, not really. And what we should strive for, I think, as Americans, is to keep producing things that we're really good at producing, something like airplanes, high tech, something like computers. things that we really are very good at manufacturing and export those to the world. So with all that said, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something today. And I do have a note to close out the show. Number one, go subscribe. I don't know if we hit 100 subscribers yet. I will check before I upload this show, but if we have, I love you guys. If not, hit that button down there. I really would appreciate it. Second of all, WeThePatriotsMedia.com is going away. So what I want you to do. So I am going to be creating. So first of all, that whole website was a way for us to get more content out to you guys, give you guys an ability to spend some money with us, but realizing that was a little bit premature, what I would love to set up and what I'm going to do before this episode is published is I'm going to create a Substack. I would love for you all to get over there and follow me on there. What I will do is make it free for quite some time. If we build up enough of a following, what I will do is ask a small amount of money per month. Same way I think a lot of different people are going about this, but what I'm going to do is make different content over there, stuff that might be a little bit better written or maybe a little deeper dive, stuff that I don't want to put out there quite directly on YouTube, but I can allude to, and we'll see where it goes. So I would really appreciate you guys going down there on Substack. Follow me up. I will put the link in the description to that, and there should be at least 1 or 2 pieces of extra material over there if you do. Again, that'll be free to start. Check it out in the link in the description. Let me know how I did, and I will catch you guys next week.
I wish I were the fucking state. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.